Hello, this is Will Faerber from Art to Ride, and today we're looking at another submission by our friend Angie in Australia. The last time we saw Angie, she was lunging her horse, so I've asked her to send in another video of lunging, and we can see a clear improvement over this time around. Once again, just looking at the body of the horse, I want you all to go back and take a look at the previous video of this horse. His belly looked quite distended, his flanks were kind of, I was going to say, bulbous out the side. And he's lost quite a bit of that. His belly is now starting to pull up. Remember that correct training is very much like Pilates for a human being. It's core development. So it's not just that the horse has to lift its back, it has to lift its abdominal muscles and strengthen its entire core in order to move correctly. So one of the things we look for is that line that starts to form along the edge of the rib cage. That we see in a human being that looks very fit and has, six packs abs, so to speak. We see that line around the rim cage. So that's what we're looking for here. Usually at about the level of the bottom of your foot there alongside the flank towards the back, you'll see that line begin to form along the side of the horse's ribs. It tells us his belly is starting to pull up and he's developing his own six-pack, so to speak. So once again, this looks much better. His walk in the previous video that we saw was a little bit sticky, a little bit like he was stepping out of mud, so to speak. Now his walk has become more swinging. He's more consistently round in the walk and more active and swinging over his back. So this is very good. I like how Angie's always walking with the horse. She's never stepping away from him when she's lunging. One of the most important things. I like to maybe keep the slack out of the line just a little bit more. He could be a little bit more active here, but she gets him a little more active and sends him through. There we go, like that. And even if he breaks into a trot for a moment, I don't know if that was particularly on purpose. I guess it was there. But even his trot here looks much better than it did before. He's swinging over his back much more consistently. We can see how the neck muscles in the top of his neck there are starting to enlarge a bit compared to what we saw in the previous videos. Once again, his belly is pulling up really nice. He looks trimmer, in other words. I mean, a fit horse should look like a trim person. They should have a nice trim waistline, so to speak, and not have a big pot belly, so to speak, that we see often on horses, especially if their backs are swayed. There's no way they're going to be able to pull up their abdominal muscles if their backs are distended downwards. So this is really good, a much better improvement in the trot work overall. Pretty much he stays on a pretty nice circle for her. I'd like to see her keep it a little more consistent. She does tend to drift around a little bit. So I'd like to see you keeping him a little more consistently, unless you're doing that on purpose, which is fine. Sometimes when we lunge in arenas, we don't want to keep in the same place and we want to move them around. Just be sure that it's your idea, not the idea of the horse. And I like how she's staying, at the top of a triangle that could be formed by the line and the whip pointing towards the hindquarters. But once again, she comes back to the walk here. And once again, this is a much better walk than what we saw before. He's swinging much more actively, staying stretched much more consistently. And I do notice that it looks to me like she's taken the stirrups off of her saddle, which if I've never pointed out before, that's a very good idea, or to have some little bags. We actually use socks that we have that go over the stirrups to keep them from rubbing on the saddles, because when you do lunge with a saddle on, they will tend to rub back and forth, on the saddle itself, which can actually cause some damage to your saddle. So taking off the stirrups, as she has done here, is a very good idea. Once again, a very nice rhythm here. I'd like to see maybe in the next time we see a little more canter and see how he can begin to swing in the canter. But just looking at the horse, he just looks trimmer. He looks more consistently forward. He just looks like he's going somewhere, so to speak, as my father used to like to say. Canter looks quite good there too. For a little bit that we saw, he was staying over his back. He wasn't just throwing his head in the air. Someone asked me yesterday, well, my horse seems to go better after I canter. Well, in about 10% of the horses I see actually can canter better than they can trot. So if the cantering a little bit improves the horse's trot and the horse can stay over its back in the canter, as you saw this horse do, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, however, if you put the horse in the canter and it runs around like a lunatic with its head straight in the air, that's only going to damage its legs. So that wouldn't be something you'd want to do. As I said, I see about 10% of the horses in the world that I see can canter better than they can trot. That's just a function of either, how they were trained. Many times we see hunter and jumper horses that never get to trot. They come out, they walk, and then they immediately go into canter. So some of those horses also canter better than they trot just because they've hardly ever trotted in their lives, So use that if you need to and if it works well for you. But if the horse falls apart and cross canters and this sort of thing when you canter, then you would want to stick to the trot until you build the muscle to it that would allow the horse to canter correctly. So you'll never improve the canter by just cantering and cantering and cantering. That's how you get horses sore. But you improve the canter. If a horse can't canter over its back, so to speak, then you want to improve the work in the trot until it can. And you'll find all of a sudden one day you'll ask it to canter, and oh, miraculously, it can canter quite well. So that's what you want to do, because if you end up with a horse that's running around like a lunatic, we end up fighting them back because people get afraid of the movement, you know, and then it just ends up in a big battle. So that isn't something you want to do. So when you see the horse cantering well on the lunge line, I say, well, then it might be something you'd want to canter under saddle. But you know, once again, we've got to always remember to go through the gears in order. You want to have your walk, working, and stretching first. And once again, you know, when I'm working a horse, my rule of thumb is if I can't get a horse to stretch within 5 or 10 minutes that I get on it in the walk, its back is probably not strong enough to do it, you know, and I can get most horses to stretch with the level of experience that I have. So if I find that I can't get it, I immediately just get off and go back, because it tells me right away there's no point in fighting with the horse. It's simply not strong enough to do it. People very often forget that horses have to be trained to carry weight. Just because they're big animals, you know, they have to be trained to carry the weight, or the back will collapse if it's not strong enough. And of course, different people have different sizes. I mean, there's a reason we put jockeys, you know, small people on horses on the racetrack, because, you know, the more weight, the harder it is for the horse. It's quite simple. So remember all these things when you're training your own horses, and take the time to be sure that you have each step correct. This whole idea of, you know, of jumping on horses and, you know, and breaking them out, you know, this kind of thing that we see, you know, all the Western movies and stuff. Well, it's just not a good idea. We end up hurting the horse, and a very good chance of hurting themselves. I've met quite a few cowboys in my life, and especially in the early days, and I'd even met some very top competitive cowboys, and they had broken every bone in their body. And, you know, some of these guys at 40 years old have arthritis in every bone in their body because they've broken every bone in their body. So it's not a good idea to put yourself in that kind of danger. You've got to remember it just isn't worth it. And there's a way to train horses that you don't have to go through that. You know, a logical training approach like we see here, where the horses are getting correct on the lunge line before we get on them, goes a long way to preserving our health and preserving the health of the horses. So this all, once again, looks much better today. It's more active. I'd like to see her keeping on a little steadier circle. Once in a while, he tends to go a little bit with his head to the outside, and that's something I would remind everybody, you know, when you're lunging, you want to have both ends of the horse on the same circle. So you want the horse to yield its hindquarters to you. That is part of submission. If you watch horses in herds, how they work each other, you know, that's part of what they do. You know, when one horse is submissive to another, it backs its hindquarters away. When horses are aggressive, they turn their hindquarters. In other words, they load their guns against you. So that's a very important aspect of training you. You get the horse to yield its hindquarters away from you. That simple act is enough, you know, to bring most horses into a much more submissive state, so to speak, than they might be. So as long as that horse is swinging its hindquarters at you, it's saying, you know, it's basically daring you. Come a little closer and I'll kick your head off, you know. And once again, that's also why we lunge with a long rein. Long line. You know, you want to be far enough, you want to be out of the strike zone. That's one of the problems that I see with some of the methods being taught to people out there today, and where they're being taught to lunge with little tiny short sticks that they call carrot sticks that are only about 3 foot long, like the lunge, and then it has a lash on the end of it, kind of longer. But the point being is the people aren't away from the horses, and I've seen and have met now many people have gotten kicked that way. And especially this idea of free lunging, you know, going into little pens with horses loose and trying to work them. You know, I found one person myself, you know, who had been kicked in the face, and another that had been kicked in the leg. And, you know, it's very dangerous. Horses are not, you know, they play. And when they play rough, if you watch how they play with each other. So that's not something you want to be doing, is going in and playing with your horse. Yes, we see some of these people who have spent, you know, a lifetime developing horses. Some of the people we see in some of these shows and things that come in and they lay down with their horses and they do all these kinds of things. Well, that's all very good, but it's also very, very dangerous. Once again, this isn't something you go try at home. A person who does that kind of stuff in a show, in an equestrian show, is somebody who spent a lifetime studying how to do that, you know. And we see people go home and try to do these kinds of things with their horses as if they were dogs. They're lap dogs that they can play with, and it just doesn't work that way because the horse is too strong and powerful. So please be careful of that. And that, once again, that's why we lunge far enough away from the horse that it can't load its hindquarters against you. So now she's going to start working over a pole. In the last video that we saw, she was working over too many poles at once. So the horse was never really getting in a rhythm, and it was kind of drifting around from one pole to the other, sometimes missing the poles, which is not, we never want to teach a horse to run out at poles, and going over a single pole on the ground is the first exercise in training a horse to jump. That is, going down to something, going over it with, minimal change in the rhythm and minimal change in the horse's posture. So that's what we want to do. So before we go over anything higher, we want to be sure we get the horse going and consistently. So what I'm seeing here is she's just a little too much letting him walk, trot, and I would like to just see a consistent pace there, though this is better now. Until he just walk over, he should walk over and keep his head and neck down. Once again, poles and cavaletti and all these kind of exercises are great for horses, as are going up and down hills and all these kinds of things, as long as the horse is working through its back when you do it. Just going up and down hills on a hollow back horse is actually going to make the horse sorer than it was probably to start with. It's not going, it may build up their shoulders and it may build up just their butt, but it's not going to build up the whole top line. We don't want to think about building the horse's butt. We want to think of building the entire top line, so the horse can carry itself correctly over its back and carry your weight. So once again, that was a nice one. He came up in a pretty good rhythm there and went over it, keeping his head and neck stretched out and forward. So that's what we're looking for. So when we go over cavaletti, there should be no big change in the horse. We want to come up. The horse should stay working over its back and just stretch into the contact. Now you can see how he's still just drifting a little bit to the outside here. He sometimes pulls his head a bit to the right as she comes into the pole. So I'd like to see you working to get the horse more in the center of the pole. It would be a good idea probably to put a guide pole. That is, you have your one pole coming straight off, put another pole at an angle on the side at which you're approaching, at the end there. So you have something to guide the horse down, like you're guiding it down a little bit of a chute there. Especially if you're working with difficult horses, because you don't want them to learn. You never want to let a horse learn that it can evade going over what you're putting them in front of, because pretty soon you try to jump and they're going to be evading the jumps in the same way. So right from the beginning of training a horse over obstacles, we want to be sure that we do it in the right way and that we keep the horse consistent in the rhythm, go over the center of whatever we're going over. Now, of course, later on in jumping, you might learn to cut corners and these sort of things. But, if you try that with a horse that's used to cutting out, you get a little too close to the corner and it's going to go right by the end. So once again, I'd like to see a guide pole on this in both directions. You can either put it as a T kind of at the top, but I think it works better if you put it, end to end. That is, one end of your guide pole is at the end of your pole that you're working over, and it's angling out a little bit to give it kind of a wide chute that narrows down into where we want to get the horse. So there's where we want him, right over the center, just like that. And that was a pretty good rhythm that time. And just the fact of stepping up like that over a pole just gives that little more action to the hock. That gives the horse a little bit of more of a workout. Once again, being assured that the horse is staying round over its top line while you're doing it. It's like that. That's not bad. Now he kind of skipped a little bit there, but that wasn't bad at all. He didn't throw his head straight up in the air and that sort of thing. If you find that happening, that you can't keep the horse round over the pole, then you need to go back and just spend more time just lunging for a while until the horse is more consistent in the stretch. Because once again, for the horse to come up to the pole and throw its head straight in there and go over a hollow does you absolutely no good. Yes, you're going over an obstacle, but you're teaching the horse to do it in the worst possible way. So this is all looking very good. Once again, to recap, this is Angie from Australia. She's done a wonderful job with this horse. She's one of our mentoring students here, and she's done a great job with bringing this horse along. I already see quite a change in his body. Look right there and see his belly. He's really starting to pull up right there, and that tells me he's really starting to work through his back. Now, once again, when you're working with those poles, I'd like to see you move more quickly away from the pole if you're going to take him away from it, so he doesn't get the idea to run by the side of it. But this horse is already taking shape. His body is looking much better. He's swinging more actively and more deeply underneath his body. The top line, I'm seeing a nice improvement in his neck. When I first saw this horse, he kind of looked like a quarter horse, and I kind of thought he was. And he's now starting to look more like a thoroughbred, so to speak. He's getting a little longer and leaner, and his neck is coming out a little more from the body. Once again, that belly, we're seeing engagement through his entire core, and that's what we want to see. That's really good. And once again, be careful about the length of time you spend lunging. Once again, once the horse starts looking tired, you want to just send him on a little bit more and then stop with that. And each day, ask that to be a little bit more and a little more active. Now, there was one thing I want to remind you. There's a place in this earlier where she stopped the horse and then went to his head, but she didn't run the line up. So just be careful that when you don't drop your whip on the ground, turn the whip around backwards and put it under your opposite arm and reel up the line as you approach the horse. Now with this horse, I'm sure she knows him very well. He seems like quite a nice customer, quite calm, but you never know when something may spook the horse. And that line on the ground, if it's there and the horse takes off, can very easily tie around your leg, and you could find yourself being drugged around the arena, which is something you never want to experience. I have experienced being drugged by a horse early on in my career, and I can tell you I was lucky enough to live through it, but it's not something you ever want to experience. So you never want to tie yourself to an animal or put yourself in a position that you may get tied to an animal. So once again, now the next video I'd like to see, Angie, I'd like to see the riding work now. So I think you've done a great job with the lunging, just picking up on those few points. I'd like to see him a little more active, but let's see a video of you riding. This has been Will Faerber from Art to Ride with our good friend Angie from Australia. Look forward to seeing her again very soon and seeing her under saddle. Thank you all for joining us today.